Hello, and welcome back to the Alexander Society. This is a podcast about history that seeks to tap into that little memory of your youth sitting around the living room on Christmas Eve while your crazy uncle downs too much of his eggnog and rants about reptilians and the government.
Yeah, that's I was waiting for the booze reference to come in.
Yeah, I'm your host, the disappointed priest at Christmas service, disapprovingly noticing all of the people in the pews that I haven't seen since Easter, Derek, joined by my friend and co-host, your uncle who's had too much eggnog, Tim. How you doing, Tim?
I'm doing pretty good. That joke would have been better if you had tried something different because I fucking hate eggnog.
Wow. How come everybody in my life hates eggnog except for me? Why?
I don't know. I want to like eggnog. It's just I like it tastes good at first, but then it immediately sours in my mouth or something. I don't know what's up with it.
Hmm. I think you just I think you're just bad.
I mean, I could just have an unrefined palate.
Oh, it wouldn't be the only thing about you that's unrefined, my guy.
I know, I know. So how are you doing tonight, Derek?
Man, I am fucking exhausted. Let me tell you what.
That comes with the territory, my bud.
Yeah, for our audience, this is going to be my first episode from my new apartment. I just moved in with my girlfriend, and we got an apartment together. So, but yeah, it's been an experience. But how are you doing, Tim?
I'm doing pretty good. I had a pretty good day. Um, I believe you've got something there that you're about to open now, don't you?
Oh yeah, let's go ahead and do that. So my best buddy in the entire world, the light in my eye, Mr. Timothy, has done something very special for me, and I'm going to go ahead and open it up.
For those of you at home, this is a keyboard that I made for Derek. It's his Christmas gift, and I elaborate on that because his was going out because he was breaking his space bar.
Yeah, yeah, I'm getting. You know how much of a pain in the ass it is to write a 4,500 word script uh, with uh, with a keyboard that double spaces every word.
I would just ignore it.
I like the color scheme. It's like the dark and the light gray together. It's like a oh my god the tappy tap. Feel the tappy tap. Oh my god. It's all good. Thank really, dude. Thank you so much for this. This is rad as hell. Oh yeah, Tim. What are you drinking?
So I got a 3 pack. I mean, not a 3 pack, but a 6 pack of Saint Bernard's, which is a Belgian beer company. Uh, I'm starting off with extra four. Yeah, I got a Saint Bernard 6 pack. It came with 2 glasses, but I already broke one of them, so I'm sad.
Yeah, that sucks.
And then I'm working on more of that stuff you gave me. I'm trying the plantation pineapple rum this week. What are you drinking tonight, buddy?
Yeah, so I've currently got $30 to my name as we speak. So I couldn't go out and get anything new.
Well, I assumed you were working on the stuff I gave you.
Yeah, I've worked with stuff you gave me. I have one thing that I just happen to have like stashed away somewhere. That my shots are going to be. It's called 99 proof, and it's a root beer liqueur.
You dumbass. 99 is a bad brand. It it might as well be rubbing alcohol.
It's fine. It's all right. It serves its purpose.
Okay. Okay.
And then for the beer, I've got some of that Iron Monk raspberry wheat.
By the way, this is the Christmas episode, y'all.
Oh yeah, in case you didn't notice from my opening where I once again mocked Tim's drinking ability.
Yeah, you're just supplanting like the generational expectations of my future alcoholism that I plan to not fall into.
Yeah. Oh, what's the what's nostalgia but in reverse? Like feeling nostalgic for a future that's never going to happen as opposed to a past that's already gone by.
Yearning. It's called yearning, Derek,
Yearning.
or pining.
There was a specific word, hauntology. That's the hauntological. That's I've there's actually a word for it that I've heard before.
Let's get on into the rules then. So, rule number one: every time I express doubt at the likelihood of an event, we'll take a sip.
Rule number 2. Every time a tale in our story includes the number 3 in some way, we're going to take 3 sips appropriately.
Please tell me you have like a way to tell instead of just like, oh, this happened three times and you mention it three different times or something.
No, it's going to I'm going to say the word 3.
Oh, okay, good. Then, every time somebody in the story comes back to life after dying, we'll do what, Derek?
We'll take a shot. And we'll also take a shot at the start of the episode, right, Commissioner?
Yes, sir. Let's get it ready.
Prost.
Kampai. So, Derek, why don't you set us up since you never want to tell me our topic right off?
Yeah. I'm not sure why I even bothered to do that, but at this point, I kind of feel obligated to. I mean, I think you knew about like the first couple topics, and then
Like the last, I think, since Musenbach. Although you kind of advertised it was going to be Musenbach, you've kind of like waited till you got the story set up and then told me, like the background.
yeah, but you also, I think, yeah, we talked about what this one was going to be, our little Christmas episode.
No.
Oh, okay. Well, we're going to be talking about the historic Saint Nicholas.
Hell yes. I am so ready for this. I've always like been interested in like the historical one because I know it doesn't really represent what we've gotten Santa Claus to be modernly.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also going to get into how he became Santa Claus,
Awesome.
which is a really funny story, a really strange story. But so I gotta preempt this though. We know pretty much nothing about the actual historical Saint Nicholas. There is one
I thought there was like three
three what?
historical figures that are thought to be Saint Nicholas. There's the actual Saint Nick, then like one or I think one of them was like later on considered a saint, and his name was Nick. And I thought there was like another person who like did the same thing.
There was a second Saint Nick who came after this Saint Nick, who was named after him, and revered this Saint Nick. And during the Middle Ages, a lot of historians kind of accidentally conflated them with one another. But then, like,
So that's probably where the third one comes from. Is it's just the combination one?
I think his name was Saint Nicholas of Sion. Um, I can't remember for sure, but he doesn't have anything to do with like where Santa Claus came from. But we will get into some of like what created the modern Santa Claus. But I do have to preempt this with we have one one primary document, and it's
So it's one of those that we don't have a lot of historical evidence for.
right. And because he's a saint, his life is almost like 99% of the stuff that we know about him is what's called hagiography, which is it's biographies of saints, which are almost pure like legend made up in the minds of either just generationally through folk tales or just pure fabrication of like medieval monks' minds, like just recording their lives. And so, what I'm going to do with this episode, since we have pretty much nothing about the actual guy, I'm going to tell you the myth, and I'm going to tell you the hagiography around. I don't like to call it myth because there are a lot of people who's like this story is important to their faith, but like I am like I am trying to be a little bit of like a historian about this, and but so I'm gonna be talking about the myth, the hagiography of his life, and I'm gonna put it into the context of the times that he lived in. And then from there I'm going to get into after his death how he became the modern symbol of Christmas.
Like this is like one of my favorite topics is like seeing how modern ideas evolved into the way they are now.
Yeah. To give you an idea of how scant information about this guy is, um, the only like even close to primary source we have from his life is a document recording all of the invitations to a council that was held during his lifetime that happens to have his name on it, and it's a copy of that list that was written like 250 years after.
Wow.
And then the other only reasons we know that he existed was because within like 50 years of his death he had 5 or 6 important churches named after him. So yeah, so that's the kind of history we're dealing with here. So bear with me because this is going to be a lot of miracles. Our story begins with it was a middle-aged Roman couple. So we're dealing with ancient Rome here, the Roman Empire. They were living in a city on the southern coast of Anatolia, which is modern day like the Asian part of Turkey. On in this coastal city called Patara, and the year is 270 AD. So that's about the time period we're dealing with. This middle-aged couple, their names were Theophanes and his wife Nana, or it could have possibly have been Epiphanius and his wife Johanna. We aren't really sure. It was one of those two. They spoke Greek as their first language. They were probably also ethnically Greek, and Greek was starting to become more the standard spoken language in the eastern part of the empire by that time. This couple, they were very wealthy, very prominent citizens of the town of Patara, and they were deeply devout Christians, which was not a rare thing at the time, but it was like right when Christianity was first starting to become a big thing. Uh, this couple had been trying to have a child for decades. It's said that they visited church every day to pray to God. They'd go to church for like a couple hours each day and just to go and pray for a couple hours. Uh, and they did that. They prayed to God to give them a child because through their whole life they hadn't had children yet.
Can you reiterate how old they were?
Um, Nona in the year 270, Nona was 50.
Oh goodness. So this is like a
It's like right,
Abraham story. Wasn't Abraham like really old when he had his son?
yeah, kind of. He kind of has the same vibes.
I was just trying to relate to a story I know.
Yeah, yeah. So God did end up answering their prayers in the year 270, and they had a son. Their son was baptized a couple days after his birth. He was baptized by his uncle, who was the abbot of a local monastery. So his uncle was a monk. And they ended up naming the boy after that uncle. His name was Nicholas. Thanks. So this family was, like I said, pretty wealthy, and Nicholas grew up very comfortable. But because of like their Christian ideals, they tried to bring Nicholas up with a sense of humility and charity and compassion for the poor, that kind of thing. They tried to teach him not to rely on worldly possessions. The story goes that as a newborn, when he was breastfeeding, he would refuse to breastfeed on fast days like Holy Wednesday and Good Friday.
So it's one of those saintly things where like they really touted up his holiness.
Right? They're trying to say, yeah, like he was a Christian before he could even talk, that kind of thing.
One of those things that's definitely apocryphal because there's no way a child knows to do that. Or if they did, that's definitely not the reason, and they just like, oh, a couple times he was like not hungry or this, that, and the other.
Right? Yeah. So that's doubted a story.
That's a sip.
Yep. As a kid, Nicholas was a little bit of a bookworm. His tutors often noted that he was a really intelligent kid, but he kind of had his head in the clouds. He was always more interested in learning about like philosophy and theology. and pondering like abstract ideas instead of more grounded subjects like rhetoric and math, which was kind of more useful, like kind of like today.
I mean, like, honestly, even though I was decent at math, I never enjoyed learning it unless it was because of the teacher rather than the subject.
Yeah. Um, the sense that I get is that he was much more of like a liberal arts kind of guy than a STEM kind of guy.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, isn't that kind of like us? We're both kind of semi-liberal arts guys.
Yeah, basically. As a the story goes that when he was a kid, he was a bit of a loner and he didn't like spending time with the other kids. As he got a little bit up and into like his teenage years, he got, that attitude that some teenagers have where it's kind of like a holier than thou sort of.
I know what I'm doing. I know what's best.
Yeah, but like specifically like about other teenagers, like
Ah,
he kind of turned his nose up at other kids who he thought were spending too much time drinking and partying instead of spending all of their time praying in church like he did. That's like that's the kind of impression that I'm getting off of this guy. So kind of a smug asshole as a teenager. It seems like he kind of grew out of it though. So once we get into it a little bit. And again, basing this all on stories that were written hundreds of years after his death based on.
that are probably, if not apocryphal, mostly embellished.
Right. Which and they're stories that were written hundreds of years after based on folk legends. So I'm kind of having to, craft something together here. But he also this is going to sound a little too familiar. He absolutely refused to interact with any women unless it was absolutely necessary because he wanted to avoid temptation.
Yeah, sure, that was why.
Yeah. His first purported miracle came when he was about 9.
Okay. So, what did St. Nicholas do for his first miracle?
It said that on his way home from his tutor one day, so he's basically walking home from school, like the ancient Roman equivalent of walking home from school. He comes across an elderly woman that's slumped over on the street, and she's holding her hand against her chest, and she's just crying over it. And this 9-year-old Nicholas approaches her and is kind of concerned for her and asks if she's all right. And he realizes that she's crying because her hand is atrophied. So she's had some sort of injury and it's atrophied her hand and it's like rotting away. And so 9-year-old Nicholas, takes this woman's hand in his hands and he prays over it for a moment. He makes the sign of the cross, and then when he removes his hands from hers, her hand is completely healed.
Yeah, no, I don't believe it. That's doubt. Sip.
Yep. Nicholas was growing up at a really interesting time in the history of the Roman Empire, which if we in 2022 can know anything for certain, it's that living through interesting times really sucks.
You're telling me.
Yeah. So this is the late third century. And during the third century, the Roman Empire was in the midst of a political and economic crisis. This period had a few different names. Some people call it the imperial crisis. Some people call it the military anarchy, which is my favorite name for it.
It why was it called the imperial crisis? Because imperialism was taking over what?
Because the seat of the emperor was constantly changing.
Okay, that makes more sense. Than...
Most commonly, though, it's just called the crisis of the third century. It was a period where the seat of the emperor was decided by whichever general had the strongest army was the emperor. That's how it went during the third century. And so although the constant civil wars and the instability was causing hyperinflation, and the currency was being devalued, the price of goods were going up everywhere across the empire, and so poverty was widespread just everywhere in the Roman world. And the constant civil wars meant that armies were always moving back and forth across the empire, which If you know your military history, that is how most plagues start.
I didn't know that. No.
Oh yeah, armies warfare is one of the most common causes of like plagues breaking out because you got an enormous group of guys all traveling together, just basically just like a mobile stew of bacteria and viruses, and they're just moving from town to town. So one of the big plagues that hit the Roman Empire during that time, it was called the plague of Cyprian, and it was called that because the guy whose writing we rely on to know about the plague was this guy named Cyprian. Who, anyways, the plague based on the symptoms that Cyprian recorded uh, was probably like Ebola.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so there was a lot of like bleeding from orifices. Basically, is the but yeah, so when Nicholas was a teenager, sometime probably like 15, 16 years old, sometime in the late 280s, both of his parents died of the plague of Cyprian, like right around the same time.
Damn. That has to suck. At least he had a good, like, he inherited his parents' stuff, right? That.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a pretty big part of his story is his inheritance. Because after they died, he sold off most of the inheritance. He sold off all of the land and all of the property and just got it in cash. And then he just started handing out the cash to the poor. So like within like the first year of after his parents' death, he didn't have like 90% of his inheritance was gone because he gave it to all of these poor people.
Damn, that's like setting yourself up for failure. Like, no, he's like how old again?
He's about 16.
I
But it's all right. He didn't need it because right after his parents' death, he moved into the monastery where his uncle lived, the uncle that he's named after.
Okay.
And so he lived as a monk for a couple of years, and then he decided he wanted to spend the rest of his life in the clergy, devoted to God. And so when he was about 18, he was ordained as a priest.
What was the age that you typically got ordained back then?
Um, it really, I'm not entirely sure. It back then, the Catholic, back then the church was the Wild West.
Was it like norm?
It wasn't abnormal to be ordained that early. It's honestly I'm not completely sure, and I don't think historians are completely sure either because you kind of have priests of all ages kind of coming up in this period of Christianity. But he does get a reputation for like how young he is when he does a lot of the stuff that he does. So um, right after he becomes a priest, one of the most famous stories about him happens, and this is actually gonna sound very familiar. This is exactly what you're looking for with this story. So he heard a rumor that there was a prominent businessman in town in Patara that had recently become bankrupt. All of his businesses had folded, and he was so desperate for money basically he didn't have any money to pay his daughter's dowries anymore. He had three daughters.
That was a big deal back then. Damn.
Yeah, he didn't have any money to pay their dowries, and so he if he couldn't marry them off, then he would be forced to sell them into sex slavery. Nicholas heard about this, and of course, being a pious and compassionate man, was very disturbed and decided that he was going to put a stop to it any way he could. So what he decided to do is he took part of this inheritance, which he hadn't given away yet, like the little bit of money that he still had left. It came out to about the this first part. It came out to about 300 gold coins. Which, by the way, three daughters, 300 gold coins.
So 100 gold coins apiece.
No, it's going to be 300 apiece. But I was pointing out it's the number three.
Wow. Oh, yeah. So three sips.
Yeah, Nicholas, he took part of his inheritance, which he hadn't given away yet. This first part's about 300 gold coins, and he wrapped them up in like a big handkerchief, so it's kind of like in a bag. He went to the man's house in the middle of the night as he and his daughters were sleeping. Yeah, so he's got 300 gold coins. He's got them wrapped up in like this handkerchief bag.
So it's actually 900 gold coins, right?
300 now. It's going to be 3 nights, 300 each night. Yeah, one for each daughter. So 300 gold coins wrapped up in a handkerchief bag. He goes to the man's house as he and his family slept, and Nick opens up a window that's right above their chimney, and he drops the bag in. And the bag ended up landing. There's a couple different translations. One translation is that it fell into a stocking that was hanging on the fireplace, and the other is that it fell in.
There's no way it was that perfect. That's doubt, Sip.
Yeah, that's dot sip.
That's not why I said that. I was like, I really doubt that. I gotta say that. Then I was like, oh wait, I just doubted something.
Yeah, that's what the rules for. But yeah, the other translation is that it landed in a shoe that was sat next to the fireplace to dry out. So that's why in some places you have the tradition of the stocking full of goodies, and then in other places in Europe, you've got the Christmas tradition of like a shoe filled with uh, you fill up a shoe with candy and stuff for the kids.
I literally never heard of filling a shoe with candy. What?
Yeah, like in the Netherlands, they've got like the wooden clogs they put right by their doorstep, and then when they wake up, the kids go and run and they grab the wooden clog, and it's full of candy and fruit and stuff.
I legit first time I'm hearing of this.
Okay, yeah, that's a thing in parts of Europe.
Well, that's very interesting.
That's going to come up again, actually. So keep that in mind. So the next day, the father and his daughters woke up. The father found the gold in the stocking, and he was able to use that gold to as a dowry to marry off his oldest daughter. And so the oldest daughter is saved. And then the next morning, another bag of gold appeared in another one of the stockings, and so he was able to use that one for his second daughter's dowry. The third night, the father decided that he was going to sit up all night and wait and watch the fireplace. And
Wait, is this sit up and wait for Santa Claus literally this old?
yes, yeah, this is the very first time it happened.
Jesus Christ.
and it's and the backstory to the very first time that happened was a father who was so desperate for cash that he was thinking about selling his daughters into slavery.
Jesus Christ. Wow.
Yeah. So yeah, the third night, the third bag fell through and into a stocking, and the father rushed out of the front door and caught Nicholas in the act.
How old is he supposed to be right now?
Nicholas, he's 18 to 20 years old at this point. This is like right after he became a priest.
Okay, so it's like nebulous, but it's still like pretty early.
Yeah, yeah, it's like the very first story of his life as like a clergyman.
Interesting.
And so the father catches him and recognizes him. That's Nicholas. That's the great generous young man that was recently became a priest. He's already kind of like well known in his hometown. Everybody likes him. They know he already has a reputation as like a kind soul and very generous, all that kind of stuff. The father, he falls to his knees and he profusely thanks Nicholas, and he is just inconsolable. He's just all over Nicholas, just telling him how grateful he is. And
He's like sobbing out of like happiness, basically.
yeah, right. And he's telling Nicholas like everybody is going to know about how generous and wonderful you are, about what a godly person you are, that how much of a gift from God that you are. And Nicholas started to panic.
Because he didn't want to be recognized for his work.
Right. He didn't want that. And so the story goes that Nicholas actually got down onto his own knees and started begging the father with tears in his eyes not to tell anybody it was him. And so the father agreed, uh, and Nicholas went on his way. And according to the story, that was the last time the two men ever saw each other. But yeah, that's one of That's definitely like one of the more famous stories about Saint Nicholas. That's
I'm sure because it very obviously is showing echoes of a lot of our current traditions.
right. Yeah, yeah. And today, I don't know if you've ever looked at like the Wikipedia pages for saints at all, but if you look that every saint kind of has like certain things that they're like the patron of, like the patron saint of. Uh, but yeah, so different saints are like the patrons of different types of things. Like the saint name that I was confirmed under when I was still practicing was Saint Michael, who is an archangel and is
How can an archangel both also be a saint?
it's just Catholics a saint is just like a holy figure that you like a that a religious person can like knows for a fact that they are in heaven and has like a direct line to God, and so you can pray to a saint and under the like idea that they'll intercede on your behalf.
Okay, it's weird, but I guess I get it.
Yeah, as far as like Catholic theology goes, it's one of the things that makes a little bit more sense. So um,
I mean, there are weirder things in Catholic theology, to be perfectly honest.
we're actually going to get into some of the weirder stuff too. So, but yeah, so like Saint Michael, my my saint's name um, is the patron saint of soldiers. That's like his sort of area. Um, but then there's like a whole bunch of others. If you look at different saints, they're the patrons of like a whole bunch of different types of people or certain professions and things like that. They might be the patrons of like certain countries or specific cities, stuff like that. Because of this story, one of the Nicholas is considered by some to be the patron of prostitutes, or one of the patrons of prostitutes. There's a few saints that are like that, but
I, 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 I don't understand how those two connect, though.
because the daughters were about to be sold into prostitution, and he saved them.
I I could understand. I understand now where it's coming from, but I still don't get how that can be fully since they didn't actually go into it. If you know what I mean,
Yeah, uh, I think the weirder
that could just be my brain just not computing.
I think the weirder one is that he's also the patron saint of sailors
How?
because he's from a port town.
That's a stretch.
That's a stretch, yeah. Take it up with the Greeks. That's their thing. But
That's a sip.
is that a sip? Okay.
I just I said that's a stretch. I'm counting it.
Whatever. So yeah, the next story that comes up in Nicholas's life is sometime probably in his mid 20s. He takes a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. One story goes that on
Remind me what the Catholic Holy Land is. Is it that the Vatican?
the Holy Land is like Jerusalem and like modern day Israel and Palestine.
Okay, I wasn't quite sure what because I know Mecca for Islam is the Holy Land. I never really thought about what the Catholic Holy Land was. I didn't even realize they had one.
Well, yeah, that whole area it's sometimes called like the Levant. But if you say Holy Land, it's if you hear anybody say Holy Land, it's not just Christians, but also like it's a Holy Land for Muslims and Jewish for Jews as well. It's just the area that was like historically like Judea, so Jerusalem and like what's now like modern day Israel.
Okay, okay, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, like Jerusalem is the most it's Jerusalem's the most holy city in both Christianity and Judaism, and it's the second holiest city in Islam. So that's why that's big reason why it's called the Holy Land. But yeah, so he takes a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. He goes by ship because that's the fastest way. Story goes that when he was on the ship, he was asleep one night on the trip, and he had a nightmare that was sent to him by God that predicted that a storm would hit the ship that he was on. And so the next morning, he gets up and he warns all the sailors, and they all laugh in his face. And sure enough, a storm hits, and the ship is at threat of sinking, and all of the sailors are rushing around trying to batten down sails. And
As conveniently happens during a lot of these stories.
yeah, one of the sailors is climbing up the mast uh, so he can draw the sail, draw the top sail. And when he gets to the top, a gust hits the sail and knocks the ship to the side, and he ends up falling off the mast and landing on his head, and which kills him instantly. And so when Nicholas sees that, he is distraught, and so he falls to his knees and he begins to pray.
I'm gonna go ahead and get my shot ready.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, so he falls to his knees and he starts to pray. Within a minute, the storm is completely gone, and the dead sailor is miraculously brought back to life. Trust.
Pompeii.
His trip to the Holy Land was mostly uneventful. There's no like major stories that come from like this part of his trip, with the exception of his last stop before he's planning on leaving. So during this time, Christianity was still a persecuted religion in the Roman Empire. And so in Jerusalem, most of the Christian sites and the churches had been torn down on orders of the emperor. And so the only ones that were still left standing was the only church literally in all of Jerusalem that was still left standing was is called the Church of the Room of the Last Supper, which is on Mount Zion. It's purported to be the site where Christ and the apostles had the Last Supper before his crucifixion.
I was about to say, unless I was literally about to say, unless that's where they had the Last Supper. That's kind of
Yeah, kind of a mouthy name if it's not intended,
it's kind of braggadocious.
right? But yeah, it's purported to be the site the of the Last Supper. Um, I think there is still a church there today. So after the long trek up the mountain pass, he finally arrived at the church and found it completely abandoned and boarded up, and its front doors were chained shut. And so, very obviously, very disappointed. This is like his last chance to like pray at a holy site and venerate God in the footsteps of Christ himself. So he starts to turn around. He's pretty disappointed. Starts thinking about what he's going to do next. And then as he's turning, the chains that are holding the door start to disintegrate. They start to crumble and just fall apart in front of him, and they fall off the door.
Press F to doubt.
Yep.
I, I, I was, I didn't mean it in that way, but yeah, I guess.
And so he's allowed to enter the church, um, and he's so overwrought with appreciation to God for allowing him this opportunity that he ends up spending several days there without food or water, just praying.
Again, press F to doubt. I'm not trying to make it you sip, but like he didn't seem like I know he studied under monks, but there's no way you just at least no water. Like
There are Christians today that are kind of like that.
I still don't believe him, or I don't believe it can go on for extended periods of time properly. And they usually prep for that nowadays.
Yeah, but of all of the stories of this guy's life, just based on how pious the reputation he had for how pious he was, that's probably one of the more believable parts of his story. So there are two accounts of what happened after his planned trip to Jerusalem. One goes that he, after a few days in this church, he heard the spectral voice of God in his mind telling him to return home. And so he ended up returning home and lived as for a few years as an ascetic, Do you know what an ascetic is?
I do not. Do you mind explaining to me?
Yeah, an ascetic is it's like a there are ascetics in a lot of different faiths around the world. Buddhist ascetics are very famous. It's a monk that will go into isolation, usually like out in the wilderness.
Wait, so that's what that one is? The person who goes into like a cave or whatever and like goes days or months without eating and supposedly meditating that whole time and still being alive.
Yeah, that's called asceticism.
I I knew of it, but I didn't know there was a term for it specifically.
Yeah, so that's one story. He returns back to the region that he's from is called Lycia. I should mention that because it's gonna come up again. But um, so that one story goes, he returned back to Lycia and became an ascetic for a few years. And then another story goes that he was so moved by his time spent in Jerusalem that he decided to stay for a little while, and he found a bunch of ascetic monks in a cave and decided to join them. And so he became an ascetic in Jerusalem. So either way, he's going to spend the next few years of his life. Again, he's like in his mid 20s. He's going to spend the next few years of his life as an ascetic. Oh yeah, by the way, he's going to be an ascetic for 3 years.
3 years
3 years.
only?
That's how most ascetics were. The famous ascetics are the ones who did it for their whole lives, but like 99% of ascetics only did it for a few years. Like 3 years was probably about average for how long a person lived that kind of lifestyle. But I was pointing out the number 3, so this 3 sips.
Oh, let me actually. I gotta get a new beer.
Okay, yeah. So he ends up spending, according to this version of the story, he ends up spending 3 years as an ascetic in this monastic cave community in Jerusalem. There's a story that during one of his rare trips out of solitude in the caves, he traveled into the city and ended up coming across an elderly man who was very deep in debt. This just an old guy on the street. He's very deep in debt. He's selling rugs to try and make ends meet, to try and recuperate some of the debts that he owes. So Nicholas, feeling compassion for this man who's very obviously he's old. He has very not able to take care of himself, and so he buys 3 rugs from this guy, and he demands that he pay triple the price that the guy is asking for these rugs. So he pays triple the price for these 3 rugs. And then on
Sorry for kind of interrupting. Go ahead and take the sip for the doubt, but like I I feel like he didn't say that he wanted to pay triple the price. I feel like he just shoved the triple the price money at him. I don't think like even if you're gonna do that, I don't feel like you say that. I think you just hand him over and just walk away.
yeah, I'm however it happened, he ended up paying triple the price for these 3 rugs. But
I know that's semantics on my part, but I just like I, I you know what I mean? It just doesn't feel like he was the kind of person who would have brought it up. I feel like he would have just like um say you owe like seven, five, $7 for a tab on something. You just hand over a 20 and walk away. I feel like that's what he did. He didn't feel like the kind of person that would be like, oh, let's talk it out, blah blah blah. No, I feel like he just handed the money and walked away.
yeah, if this did happen, that's probably how it happened. But I'm just explaining like the spirit of the story. Yeah, so Nicholas he bought 3 rugs from this old man. He paid triple the price for each of them, and then on his way,
Actually, hold on. I argue we have to take 3 more sips because 3 rugs, triple price, that's three as well.
I'm happy to follow along with that. It's not what I intended, but 100%, let's do it. But yeah, so he bought these 3 rugs, triple the price. On his way back to the caves, he ended up stopping by that old man's house, and he dropped off the rugs there.
He gave them back?
He gave them back so that he could resell those rugs again.
That's kind of crazy.
Yeah, the man's a saint, like literally.
So maybe tiny deal, maybe not. Is like baffling bouts of generosity like what saints are known for as well, or is that just particularly Saint Nick?
um, it's common amongst a lot of saints. Most they're generally a saint is usually like a martyr. It's not necessarily like a matter of like generosity. It's more a matter of like piousness, or they end up being killed for their faith, stuff like that. Um, but Saint Nicholas is specifically like he is the generous saint. He is the saint of generosity. That's what he's known for.
So he's going to be known more about it than others, but he's not. It's not out of the ordinary.
Yeah, there's a lot of saints that are very generous. That's a common thing to come. It's a pretty common thing to find in the lives of saints. Somebody who's rich and they give all of their wealth away to the poor. That's a really common saint like life story, like background. But Nicholas is just every single part of his hagiography is just filled to the brim with him doing stuff like this. So it's what he's known for. Yeah. So Nicholas, after 3 years of living as an ascetic, he received a dream from God telling him to knock off all of the ascetic stuff. Stop being an ascetic, because God has other plans for you.
I know this is going to be a semantics, and you're probably expecting it, but I doubt it was God. I think he got tired of it, even if it's not like in a bad, like he just I can't keep it going. So sip. I understand that you kind of mentioned it earlier that aesthetics can't aren't really for the long haul, but I majorly doubt it was God. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. So God told him that his destiny lied in the city of Myra. So he packed up what little he owned and he headed to Myra. He didn't know anybody in Myra. He didn't have any connections to Myra at all. When he showed up, he lived as a beggar, eating food that had been thrown out. And mostly his begging was just like because he got food from eating out of the trash, and he slept on the floor on church floors. And so when he went out begging, he'd get money from people and then he'd just give it right back to other poor people.
Interesting.
Yeah. Every opportunity to talk about how generous this guy was. But right around the time that he arrived in Myra, the previous bishop of Myra, who the the bishop of Myra was also the archbishop of the entire province, the Roman province of Lycia, which is a pretty common thing. A lot of like if you hear like if somebody holds the title of archbishop, they're also the bishop of like a specific city, like the pope. The pope is the leader of the entire church, but the title of pope belongs to whoever is the bishop of the city of Rome. So it's kind of that thing. So if you're the bishop of Myra, you're the archbishop of the entire region of uh, of Lycia. So yeah, so right around the time that Nicholas has moved to Myra, the previous bishop of Myra, who was also the archbishop of the Roman province of Lycia, had just passed away. And so all of the bishops from Lycia got together in Myra so that they could elect a new bishop, a new archbishop. The vote between the bishops was horribly deadlocked. They couldn't come to a decision at all. And so one story goes that there's two stories. Again, a lot of these have two different stories. One story goes that one of the bishops proposed that they should just sit around and not do anything and wait until God gave them a sign on who should be the new archbishop.
Yeah, that's gonna work out so well.
That night, one of the bishops received a dream while he was sleeping, received a dream from God, and God told him that Nicholas should be the archbishop. Again, Nicholas is essentially a hobo at this point. Another story goes that in order to break the deadlock between the bishops, they decided that whoever was the first priest that walked through the doors of the cathedral in Myra would be named the new archbishop, and they would just let God decide who would be the first to come in. And so the first priest who walked into cathedral bright and early the next morning was Nicholas.
I forgot he was a priest at first. Oh,
Yeah, he's still a priest.
okay. That's crazy.
Yeah. And so imagine this disheveled homeless man living off of trash, sleeping on a floor, probably wearing rags, walks into a church one day to pray, and a bunch of bishops in like their nice, well kept, clean, pristine robes come up to him and say, God has ordained you to become the next Archbishop of Lycia.
I don't care how devout I am. I would have told them this shit twice and fell in. Like, I wouldn't believe them. I would think they were pulling a prank on me. If you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, like, you fucking with me? How'd you know I was a priest? It's like, there's a lot of loose ends in a lot of these stories, but
Obviously, but I just like I wouldn't believe that like. I think they'd be pulling my chain because like me personally, I have a lot of like, oh, I'm not worthy thing kind of thing on anything I do, and I'd be like, oh no, there's no way.
yeah. So this part we're getting to right now, when he becomes the Bishop of Myra, is when we have like verifiable, like at least somewhat provable facts about the actual say of the actual Nicholas.
So this is like this part coming up is like the most likely to be true.
Yeah, it's all still like the same kind of stories, but we do know for a fact that sometime around the year. Okay, and this is the crazy shit. This is going to be more of the three sips thing. Um, it was the year 303. He was 33 years old when he became the Bishop of Myra.
Okay, we're gonna make it four sips because I doubt that, but we're not counting each of those individually as different three sips because we both be dead. Because I don't think our that'd just basically be a guzzle at that point or finish our beer because that's a lot.
Yeah, I do really like this one. It's pretty good. But yeah, so 33 years of age, Nicholas becomes the Bishop of Myra, which is where he now gets the name that he's most well known for, Nicholas of Myra. And being a priest at 18 was not an abnormal thing to happen at the time. Being an archbishop at the age of 33 was in
It was very abnormal, I'm guessing.
that's a crazy young age. Like most of the bishops at the time were like in their 70s. Like guys that are like 10 or 15 years over the life expectancy of the era are the kind of guys who become bishops.
That's kind of what I thought. It's the old fart that somehow lived this long.
Yeah. And so that's how he gets one of his more famous nicknames, the boy bishop.
I don't think he's a boy no more.
Compared to the other bishops, he's absolutely a boy.
I get that, but like not no boy. He no boy.
This next story, um, it's considered to be one of his miracles. I don't think it's a miracle because it's there's nothing really like divine about it. Like even I don't know, maybe it seemed more mystical by like the ideology of the medieval Christian church, but it has to do with his consecration mass. So whenever
I thought consecration was post mortem.
lots of things can be consecrated. You can consecrate You can consecrate a corpse. You can consecrate uh, a bedroom. You can consecrate like a building. You can consecrate a person. You can consecrate lots of different stuff. But in this specific context, a consecration is referring to the actual like mass, the church service where he is officially made a bishop. So this miracle is associated with his consecration as a bishop. The story goes that um, so everybody in Myra's a pretty Christian city at this point in the Roman history. Um, Everybody in town is very excited about the new bishop. They've heard they've heard that he's ordained by God. They've heard rumors of his generosity from his hometown of Patara, and so everybody's plus you know it's it's 303 AD. Nobody has cable. Nobody has anything else going on in their lives, so they're going to go to a consecration for an archbishop. It's the most exciting thing that's happening.
If I might postulate based on my incomplete knowledge of history, I would also say it probably was expected. Like,
Yeah, yeah, typically because even like big, moderately big cities like Myra, it's kind of it people like just because you don't have anything else to do except for talk to your neighbors. So like everybody's gonna kind of not know everybody else, but kind of like be familiar. It's kind of there's gonna be more of a social attitude of like you gotta kind of show up to stuff when it happens, and if you don't, you're kind of like what? Why do you even live here? What's the point? Is that kind of thing. But yeah, so there's this lady, there's this woman. Um, she's home alone with her baby, and she's so busy with her chores that she completely forgets that today is consecration day. It's the day that Nicholas is becoming the bishop, and so she's doing some of her chores. And one of her chores is she's giving her baby a bath. She's got a little wooden bathtub for her baby. She's bathing her child. And then she hears the bells in the cathedral start to chime. And she realizes that the mass is about to start. The consecration is about to begin. And she starts to panic because she's afraid she's going to miss it. And she's kind of like she's so excited to see this, and she just rushes out of the home, completely forgets about her baby. She runs all the way across town to the cathedral, makes it.
that's kind of fucked up, by the way.
It's kind of fucked up, yeah. But she arrives just in time to attend. But as soon as she shows up, she's in the middle of this thronging crowd of people who are funneling into the church. She rushes in and she sees Nicholas. And as soon as she sees Nicholas, she has this sudden realization: oh my God, I left my baby in a pool of water unattended.
You dumb bitch.
And so she starts breaking down crying and she's panicking and she's kind of causing a scene. And so Nicholas notices her and he comes over and he's like, what's wrong? What's going on? And she says, I was so eager to come to your consecration that I forgot my own baby. I left my child in a tub full of water, and my baby surely drowned by now. And so Nicholas, just cool as a cucumber, just is just like, nah, your baby's fine.
I'm gonna get that shot ready.
Well, it's not even going to be that. Like the baby never died.
You're telling me it's not considered revival.
No, like he was just like, no, your baby's fine. Just go home and take care of your baby. Don't worry about this. And so she rushes home, and sure enough, the baby is still just sitting there in the water, playing and laughing, and just happy as always.
Press F to doubt, so that's at least a sip.
It's at least a sip. It's not a revival. I could get. I. It's a stretch to even call this a miracle. But yeah, that's one of the miracles that he's associated with for some reason. I have no idea why. But yeah, so Nicholas he becomes a he's now the bishop of Myra, the archbishop of Lycia, and by all accounts, he was very good at his job. Understandably, he literally gets messages from God in his dreams. So um, the stories go that he spent most of his time uh, ministering to the poor, which is that's his whole thing. He takes care of poor people. That's what he's famous for, and he does such a good job of this. He's so like Myra becomes kind of renowned as like it's got the richest poor people in the Roman Empire. It's like kind of if that makes sense, but he starts to get kind of a name for himself. He kind of starts to become famous even amongst non-Christians in the empire. Like a lot of this is like a crazy thing about like this period of Roman history. Um, one of the big reasons that Christianity got so big in the Roman Empire is because early Christians were so community minded and so selfless in their service to the poor that even non-Christians like pagans deeply respected them and loved to have them in their communities. It was only like the patricians and the emperor that didn't like Christians and that kept ordering um, their
If I might interrupt, where the fuck did they go wrong?
I would argue it's actually got something to do with this story. There's this thing called the Council of Nicaea that I'm going to talk about in a minute.
I've heard of that.
But yeah, so yeah, he's becoming like this pretty famous guy within the Roman Empire. He's pretty well known as like one of he's well known for his generosity. There's a story that's again just like everything else, but this one's especially dubious because this is the kind of thing that you would have some historical records of, and we just don't have them, which doesn't necessarily mean it didn't happen, but it's not without outside of the realm of possibility, but we just don't have any evidence for it. Um, but it's an important part of his saintly life, his saintly hagiography. So in the year 305, there was a staunchly anti-Christian emperor of the empire named Diocletian, and that year he abdicated the throne. And Diocletian's a really interesting guy. He's one of the greatest Roman. This the lifetime of Saint Nicholas like saw like three of like the top five greatest Roman emperors of all time, and this is one of them, Diocletian.
Okay. Never heard of him, but again, not the history buff, so just on me probably.
He was really interesting because he didn't end the crisis of the third. Well, he did kind of end the crisis of the third century, but he was kind of a reformer. Um, he reformed the Roman Empire and helped solve a lot of the problems that caused the crisis of the third century in the first place. Um, was one of the figures that kind of brought back Rome from collapsing like 200 years early. Um, but he was very anti-Christian. He very staunch traditionalist, hated Christians. Um, one of the reforms that he put through was he established what's called the Tetrarchy.
I have no idea what that is.
The Tetrarchy was this period of Roman history where they had four emperors at the same time.
Interesting.
They'd have they'd have a senior emperor. They'd have two senior emperors, one that ruled in the west, one that ruled in the east, and they held the rank of Augustus. And then each of them would have a junior emperor under them that held the rank of Caesar.
Can I just say, sigh for those nomenclatures?
They were It's cringy now. It made a lot more sense to them, but
I know, I get it. Probably did. I just historical context is key.
yeah. So that was I mentioned in the Attila episode that by the late Roman Empire, there was the Roman Empire was divided between the western half and the eastern half. Diocletian was kind of the start of that. He didn't officially do that. It wasn't officially divided yet, and it was kind of a slow, long process to that point where there was like an official division. But this was the start of it. Was under Diocletian, and it started with his system of the tetrarchy. And the logic behind the tetrarchy was that a lot of first the empire was so big that two different having the empire kind of separated administratively between two different emperors would help out with administering that enormous landmass. And then the second logic to it was that whenever an Augustus died, then his junior emperor, the Caesar, would be able to immediately rise to take his place. And so,
It was creating a line of succession, which you need. You definitely need.
yeah, which yeah, that was one of the major problems during the crisis of the third century is that an emperor would die without a clear heir. And so every general with an army would immediately say, well, if there's no heir, I might as well throw my hat into the ring, and then there'd be a civil war. And so this was a way to kind of try to prevent that. And it didn't really work, but it was better than what they had before. So, but yeah, so Diocletian, he abdicated the throne and left it to his tetrarchy just to, kind of see what happens. And it's funny, Diocletian would end up retiring to he retired to his rural estate in what's now modern day Bosnia, I think, somewhere in the Balkans, and just became a cabbage farmer.
My cabbages!
My cabbages. Yeah, he once the most powerful man in the Mediterranean, all of Europe and North Africa and West and the Middle East, and he retires so he can grow some like. I bet he had some really nice cabbages too. I bet he,
Definitely.
but yes. So he retires. His four successors step up, and they immediately start a wave of crackdowns on Christians around the year 305. Nicholas, being one of the more prominent Christians in the empire by that time, ended up, according to the story, getting thrown in jail in the year 308. He ended up being kept in solitary confinement while being periodically tortured for 5 years.
Goodness.
And then something magical happens.
God steps in, or blah, blah, blah.
A lot of Christians would say that God did step in, but not quite. Constantine the First stepped in. Emperor Constantine the First, who was the son of one of Diocletian's successors. He fought a few civil wars, and now he was the senior emperor in the empire. He issued a law called the Edict of Milan in 313, which granted Christians free worship and it freed all imprisoned Christians. So let's talk about Constantine for a moment, because Constantine, like I mentioned with Diocletian, so the three emperors I referred to, who within Nicholas's lifetime, like three of the greatest emperors that Rome ever had. The first one was Aurelian. The second one was Diocletian. The third one was this guy, Constantine. He's also known as Constantine the Great. But Constantine, uh, he was the guy who decided to turn a little Greek trading port called Byzantium into the second capital of the empire, which ended up being named after him, Constantinople.
There she is again.
There she is again, yeah.
Isn't that 2 episodes in a row that we brought up in Constantinople?
Yes, it actually is. We mentioned in the Attila episode this emperor's birthplace, the city where he was born, was burned down by Attila's armies. The city of Naissus. Yeah, uh, but Constantine is also very famous for being the first Christian emperor of Rome. It's okay, so this part is probably going to be one of the more controversial things I've said on this show, but I'm going to back up what I'm saying. Um, Constantine was undisputably the first Christian emperor, and he's very important to like Western Christianity because he is, in large part, of all of the people that have ever lived, he is probably, as a single person, contributed more than any other single person to the proliferation of Christianity throughout the world. There have been very few people who have done as much as him, but he didn't do so when he was a Christian. Yeah. So the common story is that Constantine became a Christian during a civil war. I think it was in 312. He was in a civil war with another Roman emperor named, I think his name was Maximinus. I can't remember for sure. He lost, so he's not important. Uh, but he defeated this other emperor at a battle called the Battle of Milvian Bridge, which took place just outside the city walls of Rome. And the story goes that the night before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine received a dream from God where God told him that if he painted a specific symbol on all of the shields of the soldiers in his army, and they went into battle with that symbol on their shields, then they would have victory. And that symbol was, have you ever heard of the Cairo?
No.
It's the, you might recognize it. It looks like a P with an X going through the bottom leg part of the P.
Spell how Cairo is spelled.
CHI space RO, because they're Greek letters.
It looks vaguely familiar, but I couldn't tell you where.
Chi and Rho are the first two letters of the Greek word Christos, which is obviously Greek for Christ. And so the story goes that Constantine put that symbol soldiers uh, onto his soldiers' shields, and then they went into battle. And during the battle, Constantine was outnumbered like 2-1.
And still one.
Yeah, and it looked for a good part of the battle. It looked like he was going to lose. His his flanks were starting to tighten up. His front line was starting to get pushed back. And then, according to the story, all of a sudden, a cross of like flaming light appeared in the sky above the battlefield, and it filled his soldiers with like this righteous vigor that motivated them to push harder and harder against the enemy legion, and finally ended up breaking them. And the enemy emperor was killed during the retreat, and he was decapitated, and his body was thrown in the Tiber River. And but that's the story, the popular story about how Constantine became a Christian. Obviously, that didn't happen. And based on what we know, like as far as archaeology goes, as far as like contemporary accounts go, he was not actually a practicing Christian until the very end of his life, because it was already it was already established, well known, he was baptized on his deathbed. but there's no proof that he was ever a practicing Christian before he was baptized. Most of the artwork that he had personally commissioned for himself, um, this is getting into a lot of complicated stuff, but I thought this was interesting enough to kind of mention. Um, so the reason that he was so, because he was very like very pro Christian. He did a lot of stuff for the Christian church, and he did end the state repression of Christianity in Rome. But the reason he was so interested with Christianity wasn't because, in my opinion, it wasn't because he was a practicing Christian. It was because he had a larger interest in, it was both because of his personal interests and because of like larger political goals. So his personal interests during this time in Roman history, there were a lot of like, I've heard them referred to as like Eastern sun cults, but there are a lot of different Eastern like monotheistic religions from places like Persia, Syria, Egypt, and in the case of Christianity, Judea, that were spreading throughout the Roman Empire and becoming a lot more popular. Uh, Christianity wasn't the only religion, like non pagan religion, that was starting to become popular in the Roman Empire during that time.
I thought pagan was just anything non-Christian.
No, pagan. I mean, Christians would say anything non Christian is pagan, but pagan typically refers to like specifically to like the break between the old gods of Europe and the new god of Europe. So like the pre-Christian pantheons are typically referred to as pagan. So like the Roman pantheon, the German pantheon, the Celtic pantheon, the Greek pantheon, those ones. So when I, at least when I refer to pagan, that's what I'm referring to.
Okay.
But it is known that Constantine himself, for the majority of his adult life, practiced a different religion that was, it's called the cult of Sol Invictus.
I have never heard of that.
Yeah, it's not a lot of people have. It's a really obscure part of this period of time. Um, the cult of Sol Invictus was a religion that came out of Persia, and they worshipped the sun as like an all powerful deity. So the same way that Christians worship the Abrahamic God as the one true God, Sol Invictus worshiped the sun as the one true God.
Okay.
And so it's a lot of, because, and then there's his personal interest in like West Eastern religions, including Christianity. Um, but there's also like the political goals, which was during this time, the aftermath of the crisis of the third century, Roman social life and the Roman zeitgeist was kind of listless, and the Roman people, like as an empire, because during for a big chunk of the crisis of the third century, the Roman Empire was actually split into three. There were two breakaway empires: the Gaulish Empire and the Palmyrene Empire. In the Gaul Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east, for a large chunk, like 60 years of Roman history. And it wasn't until Aurelian that it was reunited. But the Roman people really didn't have like a uniting sense. They were starting to lose like a uniting sense of Romanness. And so I think is going on is that Constantine wasn't necessarily a Christian himself, but recognized Christianity as a potential uniting force within the Roman Empire. If he could get as many Romans Christian as possible and then make the seat of the imperial throne, the emperor, the representative of the church in the political sphere, by the mandate of God, then he could shore up the political loyalties of these disparate parts of the empire back into the to kind of bring them back into the fold, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
So that was long. That was kind of ranting, but this is, again, this is a period of like, I'm literally studying this in school. This is like my entire. This is what I want to make a career off of this period of time. So I'm if any chance to get into this stuff, I'm gonna get into it. But anyways, so Constantine, whatever the case of like what his personal faith was, it is indisputable that he was one of the greatest patrons of the early church. And thanks to his Edict of Milan, according to the story, Nicholas was allowed to go free. So Nicholas, he went back to his work. He's starting to get up in there in age. He's about middle age by this point. Let's see, 370. So yeah, he's in his 50s now. It's the year 325. And this is where we get to the Council of Nicaea. So in 325, Constantine called a convention, a conference, where he invited somewhere between 200 and 300 of all of the most prominent churchmen in the entire empire, bishops, archbishops, theologians, prominent priests, all the famous Christian leaders. Called them to the city of Nicaea, which was just a skip. It was practically in Nicholas's backyard, just right, like it's like a day's ride north of Myra. And this council would formally decide what the teachings of the church would be, what the actual concrete beliefs of the church are.
This is the one that decided what books of the Bible were canonical, correct?
No, that would not happen.
Then what council that I'm thinking of?
I it might be the Council of Chalcedon. I can't remember for sure, but no, that wouldn't happen for another.
Wow, that's what I thought Nicaea was this whole time, was the one where the books of the Bible were decided what was canonical and what was not.
That's a common mix up because they seem like they'd kind of go hand in hand, but no, the Council of Nicaea was just deciding what do Christians actually believe. It was deciding based on that because at the time the church wasn't really like a church. It was a bunch of people who vaguely agreed with each other. The only thing that most Christians really agreed on as a whole was Jesus was sent by God, died for our sins, rose from the dead. That's all they could agree on. And so Constantine called this council to decide what it is that they actually believed. This council would end up going on for about a year. Is how long it would last. And of course, I based on what I've been able to find, Nicholas was probably there, but it's not known for certain.
Okay.
But it would make sense if he was if any of the stories hinting to like how famous he was or have any accuracy or validity to them, he was probably there. We just don't have any like yeah, we don't have any like contemporary sources that say definitively that he was. And so this council would be the first step on establishing an actual coherent church orthodoxy. It was held in the city of Nicaea. It was be the first the full length name, the first ecumenical council of Nicaea, as it came to be called. There were at this council, there were obviously like there's always going to be disagreements. There's people coming from as far away as Britain and Egypt all coming together with their own interpretations of what Christianity should be. There are obviously going to be some arguments, and some of them were going to become heated. None of the arguments were as heated as one specific issue. This issue was raised by the bishop of the Egyptian city of Alexandria. There's this guy named Arius. The controversy of this argument revolved around Arius's belief in the nature of the Trinity. You know that the Trinity is. It's the Father.
Yeah, no, I know what the Trinity is.
Yeah, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So most Christians, this is going to get into some like weird early Christian theology. So bear with me. Most Christians at the time, as well as today, believe that the Son, that part of the Trinity, Jesus, had always existed alongside the Father even before his presence on earth. And so the Son was co equal, or as the Catholic Church would call it, consubstantial to the Father within the Trinity. So the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all equal parts of the Trinity. None of them are more important than the other ones.
Okay.
Arius argued that Jesus had not always existed, and that his existence began with the Immaculate Conception when he was conceived within Virgin Mary. And so as a result, the Son could not be equal to the Father because the Father had no beginning and end. So if the Son had a beginning, then he couldn't have always existed by the Father, and so he couldn't have been equal to the Father. It's as simplified as I can possibly make it. Does that make any sense at all?
It does, but in like a that makes no sense at all kind of makes sense.
Right.
Because that's stupid.
Yeah. According to the stories, one of the loudest and most passionate opponents against Arius's ideas was Nicholas. He was, according to the hagiography, he was the spearhead of what became called the Trinitarians against Arius's ideas. And so, whenever Arius would stand up to speak at the council, Nicholas would he would yell at him, he'd interrupt him, he'd try to get him to shut up, he'd yell at him to sit down and to leave, and all that kind of stuff. Just being disruptive. One of their arguments became heated. They got into argument just in the middle of this council. And in a rage, there's a few different versions of the story. I'm going to tell you my favorite one. In a rage, Nicholas walked up to Arius, took off his sandal, and slapped him across the face with it. Now, that's my favorite version.
I love it.
An earlier version, one that appears earlier, says that it was just an open hand slap. Another version says he full on punched Arius so hard that it knocked him out and broke his nose.
Hell yeah, Saint Nick throws hands.
Saint Nick throws hands, yeah. But this was, of course, a big deal because even at the time, it's the same now, but even at the time, it is deeply sacrilegious to do violence on a clergyman. It was like literally a violation of the laws of God to strike a clergyman, to strike a priest or a bishop. And so he did this in front of 200 or 300 other bishops.
Holy crap.
And so they had no choice but to defrock him. Defrocking means that he was literally, back then it just means you're removed from, like, if a priest is defrocked, it just means he's no longer a priest anymore. Back then it means they were physically took off your frock and you were stripped naked. And it's literally like, it's both literal and symbolic. Like, they're taking the frock away from him, but symbolically they're taking away his position as bishop. So they're literally stripping him of his position as the bishop of Myra. That wasn't enough for Constantine, who thought this was an outrage. Emperor Constantine, of course, was present. And Constantine had him arrested and placed in a dungeon cell overnight with shackles on his wrists. Again, naked. And so the story goes, this is another one of his most famous miracles. The story goes that night, completely naked, chained up in a jail cell, he was praying. He was on his knees and praying, and a vision of Jesus and Mary came to him, and more or less just told him, "You were absolutely right to hit him. You were in the right to strike Arius. He is absolutely wrong, and he's leading the flock." Basically, just proving him right. Just telling him he was right to do violence onto that guy. And then before Jesus and Mary left, they unlocked the shackles on his wrists and they gave him his robes back. And so the next morning, when the jailer came to take him before Constantine so that Nicholas could receive his sentence, they found him in his bishop's robes, no longer naked, with his shackles sitting unlocked next to him on the wooden bench. And so when Constantine and the other bishops found out about this, they took it as a sign of God and they immediately reinstated him as bishop. And then, of course, uh, Arius's views were not included in the Nicene Creed, which is the statement of it's the statement of belief for I know it's the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches say the Nicene Creed. I think Anglicans do as well, and some Lutherans, but I'm not sure about that last one. But the Nicene Creed, like when I went to church growing up, we said the Nicene Creed every mass on Sunday. Like it goes like I believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. And just it goes like that, and it outlines all of the beliefs of the church, like the very basic bare bones belief. I'm going to tell you if Nicholas was actually at the Council of Nicaea and if he did actually slap Arius, this is what I believe actually happened. What I think actually happened is that Arius was already unpopular, and Nicholas's fellow bishops, who already liked him, convinced Constantine to have him freed.
That honestly makes more sense than the apocryphal story you probably told. I mean, like, who knows what was really said, but like at the end, it doesn't really matter which story is true. It ends up in the same spot. And honestly, the first story is more fun.
Nicholas is now he's now famous not only as the most generous bishop in the Roman Empire, but also as the guy who slapped Christianity's first heretic. Because that's what Arius is kind of famous for now, is he's the first Christian heretic. And so with that little with those little merit badges on his sash now, he returns to Myra once the council is over, and this is about the time that the hagiography starts to get into. I'm sure he was doing this kind of stuff before, but this is when it starts to get into it. He becomes a crusader against paganism.
Like an actual crusader, or just
Not an actual crusader, but like a basically he was kind of like a lobbyist. Is basically what was happening. So what he was doing was he would go to Roman officials in a particular city where there was like a pagan temple to like a Greek or a Roman god, and he would demand that the temple be torn down. And by this point, Christianity was starting to have a little bit more institutional power thanks to Constantine. And Nicholas suddenly found himself in this period with not just a lot of authority within the church itself, but also within the Roman political system.
interesting.
And so his word carried a lot of weight. So whenever he went to these administrators, these whatever bureaucrats or governors, he typically got his way. And so all over Anatolia, uh, pagan temples started coming down and being turned into rubble, and their plots paved over and have these nice fancy new Christian churches built over them, that kind of thing. But there was one place that Roman officials just absolutely refused to tear down no matter what.
Don't keep me in suspense. What was it?
This is actually a place that we mentioned in the very first episode of this podcast. It was the Temple of Artemis in the city of Ephesus,
Oh, damn.
one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and according to legend, burned down on the same day that Alexander the Great was born.
Holy shit.
Yeah, that temple is still around. It's about 330 AD, and these Roman administrators they just won't do it. They won't do it. It's too It's a beautiful work of art. It has an ancient history. It's associated with Alexander the Great. You can't tear that down. Alexander? The hell? But Nicholas, being a 4th century zealous Christian, was not much to care about historical significance all that much.
I would have never guessed.
And he was dead set on having that thing torn down. So, one version of the tale goes that in a rage, he brought an iron hammer to the temple of Artemis and he destroyed the thing itself. He destroyed it himself. He just started beating away at the columns and the statues until the whole thing collapsed. Keep in mind, the Temple of Artemis, I think it's about 180 feet tall. And like the columns that rung the outside of the temple were like the same width around as like redwood trees in North California. And this 60-year-old man is supposed to have, with one iron hammer, clobbered the thing down by himself.
Bullshit.
I kind of took that story a little bit more metaphorically. But of course, there's another version that all he had to do was he prayed to God to destroy the temple, and the temple dissolved into a pile of dust. Um, so that's, oh yeah, you showed some.
Gout. Sip.
Um, Either way, frankly, I don't believe either of those stories, but it is a fact that around that time the Temple of Artemis was torn down, and that it was torn down because of the prominence of Christians in Anatolia at the time and putting so much pressure on local administrators. And Nicholas, who was 99.99% sure, most likely was probably a real guy who was actually an archbishop in the region at the time, probably played a pretty significant role in its destruction. So, kind of pissed off about that. I kind of wish that that temple was still around because that'd be pretty neat.
There's so many things historically that I wish were still around. It's not even funny, Derek.
Yeah, there's that. That's the historian in me. It really hurts to read a story about this. It's kind of glorifying the destruction of. I mean, like the temple of Artemis that the god struck down to warn humanity about the coming of Alexander the Great. Like that's a historically significant, like, the story wasn't like none of the stories about the temple are true, but like the cultural role that it played in all of these periods of history and just the sheer magnitude of the size of the temple and the artistry with which the temple was built, just on its own without any of the history behind it, would have been worth preserving. And
There are so many things that have been destroyed throughout history that I really wish hadn't. Like, the easy, low hanging fruit is the Library of Alexandria. I would have loved to have seen that.
ooh, I'm gonna disappoint you real quick, but then I'm gonna.
Probably didn't actually happen.
Oh no, it definitely did. Like Julius Caesar, it definitely burned down while Julius Caesar was assaulting the harbor at Alexandria. The thing was, by the time that it burned down, it was practically empty
Interesting.
because by that time the Roman the Roman Republic was everywhere. I disappointed you about the Library of Alexandria, but there is another library that is everything that people think that the Library of Alexandria was and more.
And it did burn.
And it did burn. It was called the Bait al Hikmah.
Is that the Muslim library that everyone talks about?
Yeah, it was the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. It was burned down in, I think it was 1253 by the Mongols.
Yeah, I vaguely remember hearing about it, but I didn't know a lot about it.
Hmm. Yeah, it's that building was where modern algebra, um, navigational science, optics, modern astronomy, um, the entire like modern scholarly field of classics was invented. Um, I mean, like the Renaissance, the Renaissance can largely be uh, like large parts of why the Renaissance in Europe happened at all can be attributed to the fact that scholars at the Baghdad House of Wisdom preserved and extensively studied like thousands and thousands of pages of classical writing from ancient Greek philosophers.
Okay.
Like the measurable effect that the House of Wisdom had on the development of human knowledge is insane to try to think about. And at the height of its prominence, of its it was going nowhere, and it was just producing more and more contributions to human knowledge, and then in the course of a year it's suddenly gone from the earth. And so yeah, whenever people bring up the Library of Alexandria, I'm always no, the Beit al-Hikmah was everything that the Library of Alexandria was, that people think the Library of Alexandria was, and more. And we lost so much more. One of the next story from Nicholas's life. This is a chapter from his hagiography that's probably the most often portrayed in artwork about him that isn't like Christmas related. And it's the story of three soldiers. There's another three.
Sip 3 times.
Yep. So there were these three soldiers, and they were serving. Typically, the story goes that they were officers who were serving in a Roman army that was passing through Lycia on their way to a Roman border province in order to put down a rebellion. And these three soldiers, while they were passing through Lycia, were falsely accused of a string of thefts that had happened while the army was passing through. And they had been sentenced to death by the governor of Lycia. Nicholas found out that the governor had accepted a bribe in the form of gold and silver from the actual thieves in order to get these three soldiers executed so that they could get the heat off of them. So some of these soldiers' comrades came to Nicholas and asked him for help. Once he heard the story, he realized he had to do something, so he immediately jumped on a horse and rode for an entire afternoon to the site of the execution. He arrived just in time, and right as the executioner was about to bring his sword down on the neck of the first soldier, Nicholas stepped in and grabbed the executioner's arm and ordered them to all three of them to be freed. And because this was Nicholas, the guy that literally everybody loved, they they did it, and all three of the soldiers were freed. And so after that, Nicholas hopped back on his horse before he could accept any thanks from the soldiers. He hopped on his horse and he rode all the way back to Myra and confronted the governor, a man named Eustathius. According to the account that I read, he called him, quote, a sacrilegious bloodshedder. And and of course, the governor, witnessing the wrath of such a holy man, was groveling before him and confessing all of his sins and begging for forgiveness. And I don't know if this is a thing, if this is still a thing that priests can do today. But the way that I read it, the way that it was implied, is something that apparently could happen back then. If a priest was accepting a confession from a person, the priest could just choose to not forgive them. And so that sin that they're confessing wouldn't be forgiven,
Like, ever?
like ever.
How would, like, this is me getting semantic bullshit, blah, 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 blah. How would another priest, if they were to go to confess and have another priest forgive them, know that?
Well, yeah, that's why it doesn't make sense to me. Like, there's a lot of reasons why this wouldn't work, but uh, based on the story, this is kind of how it was implied: was that he refused to extend his forgiveness to this governor for his crime of trying to execute three wrongly accused men. And so, as a result, God refused to forgive him as well. And so he was sent to hell when he died.
Yeah, right. Like that's how it would work.
Yeah, I don't know. It, it's a saint story.
Well, from what I understand, if in Christianic lore, there's like nothing you can't be forgiven.
That's a matter of debate. Within the Catholic Church, there's this idea of there's two different kinds of sins. There's venial sins and there's mortal sins. A venial sin can be forgiven, but a mortal sin, it can still technically be forgiven, but you still go to hell for it.
Not purgatory, because I know Catholics believe in purgatory.
Yeah, if you commit a mortal sin, you skip purgatory. You just go straight to hell.
Wow. What's the point of getting forgiven then?
Um, well, it's just the idea God can forgive any sin because God is all powerful. But if you commit a mortal sin, it's kind of understood. And a mortal sin is really serious shit, like mass murder and stuff like that. Like a murder is a mortal sin. Um, Also, I think a slave betraying their master is also a mortal sin, but get
Oh shit.
we're not gonna get into that.
That was dogma. That like let's like remove the aspect of whether you believe or not. That was definitely something human added, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah. If
Like like out of everything you could look at in the Christian Bible and debate on, that was definitely not what I don't believe that's in line with everything I've learned about the Abrahamic God.
yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of weird stuff in the Bible. There's also a lot of good stuff in the Bible, and the Bible, generally speaking, the Bible wasn't great. Didn't reflect very well, generally speaking, on people who own slaves. So, but anyways, so that wasn't the end of the soldier story with Nicholas. So after their campaign, they went those three soldiers, the three officers in the Roman army that were sent off to put down this rebellion. Their army comes marching back through, very successful, triumphant, and they're passing back through Lycia, and they stop in the city of Myra, where Nicholas is. And the people of Myra throw out the red carpet for these soldiers, these returning war heroes who've successfully preserved the integrity and the loyalty of Roman subjects, that kind of thing. The commander of the local garrison at the city of Myra, just this old, like, bottom of the barrel officer, hadn't accomplished anything with his military career. Um, it just got a shitty posting at a small capital garrison in Asia Minor. Not an important guy at all. He's very jealous of these soldiers getting all of this attention and praise and these giant feasts that are being held in their honor. He's very jealous. And so this garrison commander went to a local prefect, which a prefect is kind of like a political representative of the emperor. So you've got the governors and the military officers, and then you've also got these prefects, which are a little bit more of a direct line to the emperor themselves. And this garrison commander bribed the prefect to go to Constantine and convince Constantine that the same three soldiers from before were secretly plotting to overthrow the emperor. The same three soldiers that were falsely accused of stealing in the last part of the story.
Of course.
And so Constantine, being a very good leader, well, I'd say leader, a very good emperor.
Stretch.
He was a good leader, but this is more of like a realpolitik sort of thing. But if you hear that somebody's threatening to, if you're a Roman emperor and you hear a rumor that somebody is thinking about trying to overthrow you, you err on the side of caution and go ahead and kill those people. That's just standard Roman emperor stuff.
Is that really just Roman though?
No, that's a pretty typical politics thing. Yeah. So Constantine ordered that these three soldiers be arrested and sentenced to death. While these soldiers are locked away, they pray to God. And they pray to God that Nicholas intercedes on their behalf and saves them just like that he had before. That same night, both Emperor Constantine and the prefect receive dreams, divine revelation. But instead of an angel or the image of Jesus appearing to them and telling them to stop, it was the face of Nicholas himself.
Wow.
Nicholas inserted himself into their dreams using the power of God and angrily demanded that the men be freed. And he gave the prefect a warning that if the three men were executed, then the prefect and his entire family would suffer that would have great suffering and horrific tragic deaths, which understandably scared the shit out of him.
Noda.
So the next morning, Constantine freed the soldiers and arrested the prefect instead. As an apology, the emperor gave those three soldiers a chest full of wealth. Just, just literally just a giant box full of gold, silver, and precious gems for them to do whatever they want with. But the soldiers now had seen the power of God and his emissary on earth, Nicholas, save their lives twice. So now they're fully devoted to God with all of their hearts. And so they follow Nicholas's example. They give the entire chest of gold, silver, and jewels, give it all away to the poor. And then they all left the army. They took vows and they became monks. And they lived the rest of their lives in silent prayer in Nicholas's honor. And so, because of that story, Saint Nicholas is also considered to the patron saint of people who are falsely accused of crimes, which seems oddly specific, but that is something he's known as.
It does feel oddly specific, but unfortunately it's necessary considering we like to just accuse people.
Yeah,
Usually those that are very good scapegoats.
yeah. So, this next story is pretty gruesome and it might be upsetting to anybody who's listening right now, so be prepared. It involves violence against children. So, be prepared for this next story. So, we're closing in on the end of Nicholas's life. He's an old man by now. He's had a long career as one of the great early bishops of the church. And there comes a story about three young boys. These three young boys, they're described either as brothers or as neighbors. And they lived in Myra. They came from families that were poor and starving. This was in the midst of a pretty bad economic downturn. It was in the middle of a famine. There wasn't a lot of food to go around. So these three boys were um, not doing great. One one evening, they've been out all day, begging for food out in the streets. It starts to get dark, and it's now nighttime, and they don't feel comfortable walking all the way back home. And so they go to a man that we know this guy. We figure we can trust him. They knock on the door of the local butcher and they ask if they can come in and have some food and have some space on the floor that they can sleep so they don't have to walk all the way back home in the middle of the night. The butcher, again, this is in the middle of a famine. The butcher's been running low on meat.
Yikes. I've got an idea where this is going. Just yikes.
And his business has been struggling. And so he gets an idea. So he leads these three young boys. These boys are described usually as being somewhere between like 6 and 9 years old. He invites the three boys into the back. He murders all three of them, and he hacks their bodies into pieces. And then he takes all of their limbs and all of their parts and he puts them into a tub, a barrel full of pickling brine. And he plans on pickling these boys and then selling their meat as lamb to unsuspecting customers. This was a very upsetting story to read. Um, but as the murder is happening, like literally, it's described as this at the same time the murder is actually happening. God is giving Nicholas a dream and telling him what is going on. And so the moment that Nicholas wakes up, he throws on his frock, grabs his staff, his I, I can't remember the staff that bishops carry have a special name. I forgot what it's called, but he grabs his staff and he rushes down to the butcher's shop and he knocks on the door and the butcher answers. And as soon as the butcher answers, the look of righteous fury and rage that is on Nicholas's face is so terrifying that the butcher immediately collapses into a crying ball and confesses to the crime and begs forgiveness. Nicholas ignores him, walks through the open door, and immediately goes back to the scene of the crime. He found the barrel where the young boys' bodies were, and so he places his hands on the barrel and begins to pray over it. And pretty soon, the lid flies off the barrel, and the three boys emerge from the brine, each of them in one piece, completely unharmed. They hop out of the barrel and they rush back home to their families.
Okay, one doubt sip, but two, that's resurrection.
Mm-hmm. Prost.
Comply.
Oh, you want to hear the worst part?
Not really, but hit me.
Because of that story, Nicholas is now considered, he's venerated in some parts of the world as the saint, the patron both of barrel makers.
Fuck off.
Yeah.
No,
And
no, just no, no.
yeah, he's
Whoever
considered.
Barrowmaker considers him a saint can fuck off and go die in a hole. I don't care what like good meaning you have on that. No, go die.
And for some reason, I can't explain this one. It doesn't make any sense. But some people, because of the story, because they were young boys, they revere him as the saint of students.
I can see that more than the barrel making. I can see that more than
I can't. The barrel maker part makes a little bit more sense because at least a barrel was involved in that story.
they're kids. They're theoretically going to be students.
They weren't students, they were poor. They were just kids. Poor kids didn't get educations back then.
I still see it more than I see the barrel makers. Like maybe like barrel people who use barrels, maybe butchers because he punished an evil one. But
Yeah. Nicholas being revered by barrel makers because of that story is kind of like it's kind of like like a Portuguese person getting excited because they heard Portugal mentioned in a TV show.
yeah, yeah,
Hey, we finally being noticed. Anyways, so there's one more story, one more miracle associated with him before his death. One year in Lycia, they had a really bad harvest, and many of the people of the region were starving. In the harbor of it was a harbor town called Andriaki, which is weird Greek name. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but that's how it looks like it's pronounced. But in Andriaki, there was a small fleet of merchant ships that was filled up with grain that was just stopping by to get resupplied, and they were passing through. They were on their way down to Egypt. Nicholas found out about the ships, and he came down to the harbor and he pleaded with the captain of these ships to leave a little bit of the wheat behind so that he could try to feed his people. And of course, the captain was hesitant because he's a businessman, and if he didn't have the full shiploads when he arrived, then he'd end up having to pay for the missing stock out of his own pocket. And so Nicholas basically just told him, God will take care of it.
Is this another one of the fish and the bread story kind of things?
It actually is good. Yeah, I called that one. And so, yeah,
That's the only logical explanation, unless God was just like, oh, the guy thought he was getting 20,000 when he was supposed to get 30,000, and they just ignored that 10,000.
so Nicholas basically just told him, yeah, trust in God. And so the merchant was like, okay, and gave him 100 bushels of wheat from each of the ships that he had, and then set off on the set sail and headed down to Egypt. When the fleet arrived in Egypt, the captain looked, and to his shock, all of his stocks had been completely refilled. He was carrying a full load of all of the grain that he needed. Meanwhile, back in Myra, the wheat that they got from those ships fed the entire city of Myra for 2 years.
I kind of doubt that the wheat would stay good for 2 years.
And then, well,
Like, I know wheat can be stored, but just that effectively for 2 years
well, yeah,
back then?
yeah. Back then they had like grain magazines where they'd keep just a giant stores of grain that would stay fresh and edible for like a couple decades. Like if you stored it right, you could store like tons and tons of grain in like just giant supply depots for uh like 20 years. It's how a lot of places avoided
Famines?
uh yeah, it's how they kind of mediated famines before they happened. Was they'd take all of their excess grain and they'd store it in these giant fuel silos. And so if they ever had a short harvest, they'd be able to pull on that grain that they've been storing up for a couple decades and use it to alleviate the famine. So yeah, it's that's not unreasonable. And then the story also mentions that that the grain that they got from those ships also provided them with enough seeds that they could replenish the seed stock that they had lost from their failed harvests, and so they were able to almost immediately alleviate the famine and were able to have successful harvests by within a few more years. So that's the last miracle that is associated with St. Patrick or St. Patrick. God damn it.
St. Nicholas.
St. Nicholas. Yeah, we're talking about a Greek man, not an Irish man. So the Bishop Nicholas of Myra, St. Nicholas the Wonder Worker, finally passed away from old age on December 6th, 343. And December 6th would end up becoming his feast day. That's the holiday that celebrates um, his sainthood is celebrated on December 6th every year. In his final moments, it's said that several angels appeared at his bedside, and his last words were supposedly, quote, I have hope in thee, O Lord. Lord, into your hands I commend my spirit. Of course, that would have been in Greek, but you know.
Obviously.
A few months after his death, there was a cathedral built in the city of Myra in his honor. And this was a real cathedral. Um, in this cathedral, his bones were interred, and numerous miracles were attributed to St. Nicholas for centuries after his death. The first miracle after his death is that shortly after his bones were interred in the cathedral in Myra, his this is going to sound this is going to sound like the most ridiculous part of this entire story, and it's not even close. The first the first post-mortem miracle associated with St. Nicholas was that after he was buried, his bones in his crypt, his bones began to excrete a strange clear liquid that supposedly smelled like roses. it just kind of was pushed out of his bones.
Doubt.
And this liquid, which they called manna after after that verse from Exodus about the manna from heaven, that all that stuff. They called it manna, and anybody who came in contact with the liquid is said to have had all of their ailments cured, whether it was like a physical sickness, mental illness, or like spiritual unwellness. And that still goes today. There's still churches with his bones that claim that they still excrete this liquid, and they sell the liquid in gift shops
Fuck those churches.
in little vials. Yeah, fuck those churches. Yeah, both a couple of them have already been sued because it. One of the churches it was discovered was actually weren't actually using anything from the bones. They were actually using. It was an old church from like the Middle Ages. It was somewhere in Italy, and it was discovered that when they were doing renovations on this church, they had accidentally broken into an old basement that had been covered up a few hundred years before, and they found a bunch of like medical ointment in jars down there that had been made in like the 1300s. And so they just took the ointment out of these old jars and bottled it into these little vials and sold them in gift shops as manna that came from St. Nicholas's bones. And they end up getting sued for that.
Sounds about priest.
Yeah. So many people throughout the Middle Ages and even into modernity have actually claimed to have met St. Nicholas, and that in their times of grief and struggle, he's given them aid, very often in the form of like saving their children. There's one story about a woman from Russia who's in like medieval Russia. Her son had been kidnapped by the had been kidnapped and sold into slavery to the imam or the emir of a Muslim country down in the Middle East. And a few years after he was kidnapped, Saint Nicholas swooped down on December 6th, swooped down out of nowhere and snatched the boy up and then dropped him back down in Russia, right in front of his mother's house.
Press F'd it out.
Yep. And so in the Middle Ages, and honestly up till today, Saint Nicholas is one of the most famous and well respected and revered saints in all of Christianity. But especially in the Middle Ages, there were hundreds of churches all over Europe that venerated that were named after him and that venerated him. Um, he wasn't actually officially canonized as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church until 1466, about 1100 years after his death.
That kind of surprised me. I figured he'd one of the like immediate guys.
Yeah, but at that point he was such like a household name. Like in the early Middle Ages, when you thought of a saint, he was one of the names you thought of. Like he was just so synonymous with saint that nobody bothered to think like, wait, we've never actually like officially canonized him as a saint. Because back in the early church, saints were kind of
Taboo.
they weren't taboo. They were very popular, but they were just kind of like made up. Like they didn't have official saints. A saint was just anybody that was like venerated as a saint by like a local community or something. One of my favorite stories about that is there is an uncanonized saint that's still revered by Catholics in uh, southern France, like rural France. Uh, the saint's literally a dog.
Best boy.
And I can't remember the dog's name now, but according to locals in it's either southern France or western France, I can't remember for sure, but these rural folk swear on their lives that numerous miracles have happened because like in associated with this dog. And so and that's kind of and so these local people kind of venerate this dog as a saint, but it's not recognized by the official church hierarchy. And that's kind of how all saints were like back during like back during the time of like the Roman Empire. Um, it's actually a not a recent thing, but like a moderately late addition to the Catholic Church that they start like actually canonizing saints. But anyways, so today Saint Nicholas is primarily venerated as the patron saint of children. That's what he's most well known for, mostly because of all of the stories about him saving children. But he's also revered as the patron of sailors, students, and people falsely accused of crimes, along with barrel makers as well.
Fuck you, barrel makers.
Fuck you, barrel makers.
No, I'm personally insulted by that, by the way.
I think it's hilarious. It's so fucking funny. Practicing Orthodox Christians in Greece today consider Nicholas to be the patron saint of their country. And because of his association with sailors, he's also specifically considered the patron of the Greek Navy. So yeah, the navy of the nation of Greece has a patron saint, and that navy's patron saint is Santa Claus.
Now that is funny.
In the year 1087, most of Anatolia had come under the control of the Seljuk Turks, the Muslim Seljuk Turks, and also 1087. That was just a couple decades after the schism that occurred between the Latin Church in Rome and the Greek Church in Constantinople, which still exists today. It's the divide between the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox churches. It's the reason why they're separate. They used to be the one big church. But sometime around 1070s, there was a split, this a schism. So it was 1087. It was just a little while after that. Some of Nicholas's bones were actually stolen from the cathedral in Myra by a group of Italian merchants from the southern Italian city of Bari, and they took all of the major bones, so like the skull, the rib cage, the spine, arm bones, leg bones. They left all the small stuff like hands and fingers and toes and stuff like that. They left those behind, but they grabbed all the big ones and they gave the bones to the Basilica di San Nicola in the city of Bari in southern Italy. And they remain there to this day. They are they're held there as holy relics, and the Basilica of St. Nicholas in Bari is now one of the most popular pilgrimage sites in all of Europe, which that's kind of irritating. um, it's even more irritating. Some people refer to St. Nicholas as St. Nicholas of Bari because his bones are in Bari, even though he never visited the city when he was alive.
That's an okay, in my opinion.
It's pretty shitty, actually.
It's very shitty.
Grave robbing a man's bones and then
Almost as bad as the Britain Church refusing to give back relics from the civilizations they've plundered.
yeah, yeah, you're right. The few remaining bones that were left in the crypt were later taken. Those were later stolen also by another group of Italians, um, a group of soldiers from Venice who were in the Christian army during the First Crusade. So literally, as they were passing through, a bunch of Venetian soldiers stopped by in Myra and just stole the rest of the bones. That cathedral is still exists in the city to this day. I can't remember what Myra is called now. It's a Turkish name, but it's still there, and the crypt is still there, and you can still see the hole where it was broken open and the bones were taken out of.
So what you're saying is fuck Italians?
Yes, what I'm saying is uh, Italians are everything that people think Jews are. Actually, now that I think about it.
Okay.
And so these Venetian soldiers in the First Crusade took the rest of the smaller bits of bone and gave them to the church at the monastery of San Nicolo a Lida in Venice. So another church dedicated to Saint Nicholas that houses his stolen bones. We respect you so much that we're going to rob your group.
That's super disgusting, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah, it's so gross. We respect you so much that we're going to rob your grave and then dedicate our entire building to you, where we're going to house your remains that we disturbed so that we could steal them. And then bits of bone fragments from that are more or less verified to have come from Nicholas. They can be found all over the place. You can find a few in France, some in Germany, one in Romania, and this one's the wild card. There is part of his hip bone at a Catholic church in Illinois.
Why?
I don't know. I have no idea how it ended up there, but it did. And you you can go to somewhere. It's somewhere in southern Illinois. It's at a Catholic church's. It's a shrine to another saint, but they have like
That's super disrespectful. They didn't even give him his own shrine.
yeah, they have an archive there with a whole bunch of um like important stuff, like important Catholic church stuff. Um and one of the items that they have there happens to be like a fairly large chunk that was chipped off of Saint Nicholas's pelvis. So yeah, if you ever want to go see the hip of a saint, the hip of Santa Claus, you go to Illinois for some godforsaken reason.
I think I'd rather burn Illinois to the ground.
Yeah. So, veneration of Nicholas eventually found its way to Central Europe from Asia Minor during the Middle Ages. By the turn of the first millennium, many churches throughout Germany, the Low Countries, France, and Britain uh, had his name on it. The practice of gift giving associated with St. Nicholas is believed to have originated in France in the 12th century. There were a few small towns in rural France where nuns from local convents would give gifts to like gifts of candy to local children on December 6th, his feast day. Yeah, so the practice of gift giving associated with Saint Nicholas is believed to have started with nuns giving candy to local children on December 6th, sometime in the 12th century. Eventually, the practice got more and more complicated. Like as years pass, as generations pass, they kept this tradition going, and every year it got a little more intricate. And eventually, they were organizing like these nuns would go out in the middle of the night and they'd go to all of the households of like the poorest people in town, and they'd go into their houses while the family slept, and they'd leave candy and toys and stuff in the shoes of the children, and then they'd leave baskets full of like clothing and money and food and stuff for the adults. And then the next day, when the children woke up and they found this stuff, they'd go to the nuns and they'd ask, where did all of these gifts come from?" And the nuns would just say, "Oh, Saint Nicholas left them." And so that's how the that gift giving tradition began, associated with Saint Nick. And that practice ended up catching on with a whole bunch of other convents and other like villages and communities, and just spread all throughout Europe, all throughout Western Europe, especially in Germany and England. During that time, so like the 1200s to like the 1500s, there's a popular tale that was told to children that the ghostly spirit, like the haunted spirit of Saint Nicholas, who was described as like skeletally thin with sunken cheeks and eyes, clothed in his bishop robes with his staff and with a long, scraggly gray beard, which strangely enough was actually what he looked like at the end of his life. But this ghost would wander through villages, and they leave gifts for nice children. And but if they came across a child who had been misbehaving, uh, bad things happened to that child. Usually, it involves some form of like kidnapping and being dragged into the woods and presumably killed and taken to hell. That kind of thing. It's very dark.
Yeah.
Medieval kids stories like really didn't fuck around. Um, a lot of this veneration of Saint Nicholas really died out in the 1500s because that's when the Protestant Reformation happened. And so the new Protestant princes of Germany wanted to get rid of the veneration of saints because they saw the veneration of saints as a holdover from Roman paganism. They saw the Catholic Church as like worshiping these saints instead of worshiping God as that's the one true God. And so they wanted to get rid of saints. Martin Luther himself, the guy who kicked off the Protestant Reformation, uh, he he knew that even though they'd broken off from the Catholic Church, that a lot of Germans would still keep trying to do this tradition every year, and so uh, he tried to divorce Saint Nicholas from the tradition, but still like keep the tradition going. So instead of Saint Nicholas, it would be this figure called the Christkindl, or the Christ Child in English, which was like a chubby baby angel. It was like the like kind of you know the image now. It's like a little bit like a cherub with a little baby with angel wings. And instead of Nicholas's feast day, they would practice this on Christmas, which was because it was the same month, so it wouldn't be that much of a change. And so there's still parts of Germany today that still use the Christkindl instead of Saint Nicholas in their Christmas traditions. But because of the Protestant Reformation, pretty much every part of Europe that had a Reformation um, stopped doing the Saint Nicholas celebrations on December 6th, but with one key exception, and that was the Netherlands, because for some reason the Dutch really liked Saint Nicholas and really didn't want to get rid of their December 6th holiday.
I can't imagine.
Um, Part of it, it's kind of speculated that part of it was like national pride because Saint Nicholas is the patron saint of the Netherlands. It's like their national saint, just like in Greece. Like there's actually three countries that consider Saint Nicholas their like patron saint: Greece, the Netherlands, and Russia. For some reason, it's weird, but um, in the Netherlands, the tradition of Saint Nicholas Day, Saint Nicholas feast, his image, the saint's image, evolved into a figure called Sinterklaas, which is just a shortened version of the Dutch name Sint Nicholas. They just kind of shortened it into one word, Sinterklaas. But Sinterklaas wasn't strictly just Saint Nicholas. It was the story of Sinterklaas was also heavily influenced by an ancient Germanic pagan myth. So think like Norse mythology
Okay.
is like just broader German mythology. The myth, the part of the myth that got folded into it was this ancient pagan story called the Wild Hunt.
I am vaguely familiar to the Wild Hunt due to The Witcher.
Yeah, it's the Wild Hunt became a really big deal in like fantasy writing in the early 1900s. Um, but the original story of the Wild Hunt um, was that Odin, the king god, the god of magic and wisdom, he would fly through the heavens on horseback, and behind him he would have an army of Valkyries, and they would be out on a hunt, hunting for injustice throughout the world, supposedly, according to some forward versions of the story. And if any person saw Odin's hunting party and flying through the sky, that meant that that meant that that person was about to die, or their community, like their village or their city, was about to be destroyed. Sinterklaas uh, got a lot of inspiration from that. So Sinterklaas, according to the story, would fly through the sky on a horse, just like Odin in the Wild Hunt, and he'd be followed by his helpers as well. In different versions of the myth, his helpers would either be demons for some reason. I have no idea why. I couldn't find in all of my research why. But one version is that his all of his helpers were demons, instead of, little elves, little evil demonic elves, or they were Moors. Do you know what Moors are?
I know what social mores are, but not what mores are.
Moor, a Moor.
No.
It's what people, it's what Europeans in the 15, 16, and 1700s, it's what they called black people.
Okay, that's fucked up.
Yeah. And so that's also where the myth of Schwattepit comes from. In this is actually, shockingly, this is still a thing in parts of, like, more conservative parts of the Netherlands. Zwarte is uh, it's Dutch for Black Pete. Zwarte was Sinterklaas's black servant. So Sinterklaas would go and give um, give toys and gifts to all of the good kids. But if there were bad kids, then Sinterklaas would send in Zwarte who would deal out whippings to bad kids, or he'd just kidnap them and drag them into the woods, and they'd never be seen again. And then this is also another familiar, something familiar. Sinterklaas also had a giant sack, just like Santa Claus. And whenever Sinterklaas would show up to town, he would sit down with some children and he'd ask them questions about the Bible. So he'd ask them biblical questions, like just to test their knowledge on the Bible. If the child gave too many wrong answers, then Sinterklaas would throw the child into the sack and carry the child to hell.
Is this where the beginning of Krampus came from?
That's what uh, Krampus is a. There were several different traditions throughout Europe that had, like, that Saint Nicholas would have like a helper. Saint Nicholas would give gifts to the good kids, and then he'd have a helper that would do bad stuff to the bad kids. And Krampus was just one version of that, from specifically from Switzerland.
Okay.
Um, and then Germany had like an evil helper named uh, uh, in English, his name was Farmhand Rupert. I can't remember what it is in German, but Germany had Farmhand Rupert. Um, a few other countries had their own versions, but yeah. So this tradition of Sinterklaas carried on past the Protestant Reformations, and the Dutch settlers in America brought the tradition over when they settled the city of New Amsterdam in the 1600s. And then, of course, New Amsterdam was, the British got New Amsterdam. They changed the name to New York City. And the first recorded use of the name Santa Claus comes from an article in the New York Gazette. How the fuck do you pronounce this? I don't. The New York Gazetteer, I think, like Gazette, but Gazetteer, whatever. New York Gazetteer by this guy named James Rivington. This article was published on December 23rd, 1773. Here's the confusing part. This article is the first use of any version of the phrase Santa Claus. The article itself was about the Boston Tea Party.
What?
So he's talking about the Boston Tea Party, but for some reason, in part of the article, he starts talking about a local gathering of Dutch settlers on Long Island who were celebrating St. Nicholas's feast day on December 6th. And in the article, he said that they were eagerly awaiting the arrival of a figure that they called Saint A Claus, like ST period, capital A, Claus, which probably came from him mishearing a Dutch person say Sinterklaas.
Sounds about likely.
Yeah. And so that is how Santa Claus entered the English language. In the early 1800s, there was this guy from New York who was a descendant of Dutch settlers. His name was John Pintard. He became really interested in St. Nicholas as a symbol of, not of Christmas, but specifically of Dutch heritage in America. He had this concept of using Santa Claus as a mascot for Dutch American pride. And so, and at this point, like a lot of people like were familiar with the idea of Saint Nicholas and his feast day and gift giving, but it wasn't associated with Christmas yet. This is really interesting. Christmas wasn't actually a popular Christian holiday until the mid 1800s.
So relatively recently.
Very recently, yes. Up to this point, actually, St. Nicholas's feast day was was a significantly more popular holiday than Christmas. Christmas itself, most Christians respected and revered Christmas for, you know, celebrating the birthday of the savior of the human soul is a pretty important big deal. But the traditional Christian, like devout Christian way of celebrating the holiday was to go to mass on New Year's Eve and then quickly rush your whole family home because the streets would be filled with drunken, crazed men uh, having a giant party and firing their guns off in the air.
Sounds about right.
That's what Christmas was uh, prior to about the mid 1850s, like the mid 1800s, because it was there were actually a lot of Christians who thought that they should just get rid of Christmas because it was just an excuse for people to get drunk and cause problems. Um, there was actually one time when a bunch of people actually did get rid of Christmas. It was when after the first English Civil War, when the Puritans were in control of the English government, they actually outlawed Christmas because uh, everybody was drinking too much. And then actually during the Revolutionary War in on Christmas Eve, 1778, or 1776, yeah. Um, George Washington had his famous victory on Christmas Day at the Battle of Trenton. After Christmas Eve, he and his army crossed the Delaware River. The reason they won that engagement, which was one of the pivotal moments of the entire Revolutionary War, was because they knew that all of the German mercenaries, the Hessian troops that were stationed at Trenton, were all drunk off their ass and hung over the next morning because they were celebrating Christmas. So that was the reputation that Christmas had in the Christian world up to this point. Christmas was a day of for getting wasted, but St. Nicholas's feast day, December 6th, was the day for gift giving and celebrating family and celebrating your children and that kind of thing. And so at this point in early 1800s, St. Nicholas was more associated with Dutch American pride. But it wasn't really a big deal. Nobody really cared. Nobody cares about Dutch national pride in America. It wasn't a thing back then. It's not a thing now. But people did start getting interested in St. Nicholas, or specifically Santa Claus, after one of the guy I just mentioned, John Pintard, one of his close friends was an author also from New York City named Washington Irving. You've probably heard that name before, right?
Mm-hmm. I don't remember from where, but I've heard it.
He's one of the greatest, produced like some of the great classic American literature. But he published a book called The History of New York in 1808. And he talked a little bit about Santa Claus. In this book, he described St. Nicholas as, quote, A jolly old Dutchman who parked his wagon on rooftops and slid down chimneys with gifts for sleeping children on his feast day.
That's completely inaccurate.
Yeah, it's he was talking about the tradition of the Dutch settlers in New York. He was talking about like the influence of Dutch culture in New York City specifically. That's why he even brought this up, because that is the interpretation. Like that is what Sinterklaas is in the Dutch tradition. But Irving's book made Santa Claus a household name in America, but again, it was still just associated with Dutch heritage. It didn't have anything to do with Christmas. And besides that, most portrayals of Santa Claus at this point was still as kind of like a skeletal, grouchy old man, rather than like the jolly fat guy that we know him as today. But there's yet another New Yorker who was actually a friend with both Washington Irving and John Pintard. He was a minister for New York named Clement Clark Moore. And he read Irving's book, and he got this fascinating idea to take the image that Irving portrayed in his book and mix it with like a sort of Christmas tradition. So kind of divorce it from its Dutch roots and kind of make it more of like a more universal American sort of specifically like a Christmas tradition. Maybe imbue some more family values into the Christmas holiday instead of just having the Dutch celebrating their nice wholesome holiday on December 6th. Move St. Nicholas to December 25th and let all Americans enjoy it. And so this guy, Minister Clement Clark Moore, published a poem in 1823 called An Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas. But we know it better by its later title that was published under a couple years later. 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. That poem, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, was one of the most popular and best selling pieces of literature in the United States in the entire 19th century.
That does not surprise me in the least bit.
And Americans began to incorporate the thoroughly Dutch St. Nicholas Day celebrations into their Christmas celebrations. And they kept doing it year after year, generation after generation, until it became the beloved tradition that we all know it as today. And that is how a Greek bishop in the Roman Empire became a fat, chimney hopping Christmas gift giver who rode in a sleigh with 8 reindeer.
That's just insane how it's involved, to be honest.
It's so much. It went through so much to get to this point.
You're not kidding. It's kind of ridiculous.
It's such a funny, ridiculous, insane story. It's oh wow. I I mean, I feel blown away even though I did all of this I'm the one who did all the research and I knew what was coming. I still feel
It doesn't matter. You can still be you can understand it and still be baffled later about it.
yeah, I'm still flabbergasted by this the 2000 years of history that went into making the modern Santa Claus.
It's crazy to think there's that much history behind it too.
It's a Santa Claus is a heavily marketed American figure based on a traditional Dutch figure, based on old practices from French convents in the Middle Ages, which were based on celebrations of a Greek bishop who lived during the Roman Empire.
Insane.
It's it's absurd. It's it's like it's like if it were any other topic, it'd be like an interesting sort of footnote with like, oh, that's an interesting way that uh history sort of does like the passing of the ages kind of does weird things to our interpretations of historic figures. But this is literally like one of the most recognizable Santa Claus is one of the most recognizable figures on the planet. Like up there next to Jesus Christ.
Yeah, honestly, immensely baffling that we can get from where Saint Nicholas starts to where we are today, and it still be the same lineage or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, it's just a line that you can trace. You can see every step of the way that it changes, and it's like watching a species evolve in front of your eyes. Ugh. So the source I used for this, it was Saint. It was a book called a short little, like more like a pamphlet. It was called Saint Nicholas of Myra: The Life and Legacy of the Ancient Christian Bishop Who Became the Inspiration for Santa Claus. It was published by
That's a long title. Pardon the interruption. That's a really long title.
yeah, it was published by like an educational like pamphlet like publishing collective called Charles River Editors. Um, Not exactly like academically rigorous, but it had a lot of good had a lot of good like basic sources in there, a lot of good reading on it. So
So, Derek, on where can they find you on social media?
oh, they can find me on Twitter at Visigoth. The first I is a one, the O is a zero. Where can they find you, Tim?
They can find me on Twitter at Tim, aka Otis. They can also find the podcast on Twitter. They can find us on Twitter at the Alex Society Pod and Facebook and Instagram at the Alexander Society Pod. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, please give us a rate and review on your streaming platform of choice. And have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Happy Hanukkah.
Happy holidays.
Bye.
If you've enjoyed our program, please rate us and review us on your platform of streaming platform. If you have enjoyed what you've heard today, please give us a rate and review on your platform of choice.